Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Guru Mahar's device is there.
Narayanam Namaskritya Dhanam Chaiva Narottamam Devim Sarasatim Vyasam Tato Jayam Udiraye. Welcome to the 23rd annual reading of the Srimad Bhagavatam at the Bhaktivedanta Ashram, ISKCON at Govardhana Hill. We're engaged in reading the third canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, and presently we're up to the 6th chapter entitled Creation of the Universal Form, starting at text number 1. The Rishi Maitreya said, the Lord thus heard about the suspension of the progressive creative functions of the universe due to the non-combination of his potencies, such as the Mahat Tattva. Purport, there is nothing wanting in the creation of the Lord. All the potencies are there in a dormant state. But unless they are combined by the will of the Lord, nothing can progress. The suspended progressive work of creation can only be revived by the direction of the Lord. The Supreme Powerful Lord then simultaneously entered into the 23 elements with the goddess Kali, his external energy, who alone amalgamates all the different elements. Purport. The ingredients of matter are counted as 23. The total material energy, false ego, sound, touch, form, taste, smell, earth, water, fire, air, sky, eye, ear, nose, tongue, skin, hand, leg, evacuating organ, genitals, speech, and mind. All are combined together by the influence of time and are again dissolved in the course of time. Time, therefore, is the energy of the Lord and acts in her own way by the direction of the Lord. This energy is called Kali and is represented by the dark, destructive goddess, generally worshipped by persons influenced by the mode of darkness or ignorance in material existence. In the Vedic hymn, this process is described as Mula Prakritir Avikritir Mahadadya Prakriti Vikritaya Sapta Shoda Shakas Tu Vikarun Na Prakritir Na Vikriti Purushaha. The energy which acts as material nature in a combination of 23 ingredients is not the final source of creation. The Lord enters into the elements and applies his energy, called Kali. In all other Vedic scriptures, the same principle is accepted. In Brahma Samhita 5:35, it is stated, Ekopya sauracharitam jagaram rakotim Yat Shakti Rasti Jagadanda Chayaya Danta Andanta Rasta Paramanu Chayanta Rastam Govinda Mari Purusham Tamaham Bhajami. I worship the primeval Lord Govinda, who is the original personality of Godhead. By his partial plenary expansion, Mahavishnu, he enters into material nature and then into each and every universe as Garbhadakshayi Vishnu, and then as Shiradakshayi Vishnu into all the elements, including every atom of matter. Such manifestations of cosmic creation are innumerable, both in the universes and in the individual atoms. Similarly, this is confirmed in Bhagavad Gita 10:42. Atava bahunaitena Kim gyatena tavarjuna Vishtabhyaham inam kritsnam ekam shena stito jagat. O Arjuna, there is no necessity of your knowing about my innumerable energies which act in various ways. I enter into the material creation by my partial plenary expansion, Paramatma, or the Supersoul, in all the universes and in all the elements thereof. And thus the work of creation goes on. The wonderful activities of material nature are due to Lord Krishna, and thus he is the final cause, or the ultimate cause of all causes. Text 3. Thus, when the personality of Godhead entered into the elements by his energy, all the living entities were enlivened into different activities, just as one is engaged in his work after awakening from sleep. Every individual soul remains unconscious after the dissolution of the creation, and thus enters into the Lord with his material energy. These individual living entities are conditioned souls everlastingly, but in each and every material creation, they are given a chance to liberate themselves and become free souls. They are all given a chance to take advantage of the Vedic wisdom and find out what is their relationship with the Supreme Lord, how they can be liberated, and what the ultimate profit is in such liberation. By properly studying the Vedas, one becomes conscious of his position and thus takes to the transcendental devotional service of the Lord and is gradually promoted to the spiritual sky. The individual souls in the material world engage in different activities according to their past unfinished desires. After the dissolution of a particular body, the individual soul forgets everything, but the all-merciful Lord, who is situated in everyone's heart as the witness, the Supersoul, awakens him and reminds him of his past desires. And thus he begins to act accordingly in his next life. This unseen guidance is described as fate, and a sensible man can understand that this continues his material bondage in the three modes of nature. The unconscious sleeping stage of the living entity just after the partial or total dissolution of the creation is wrongly accepted as the final stage of life by some less intelligent philosophers. After the dissolution of the partial material body, a living entity remains unconscious for only a few months. And after the total dissolution of the material creation, he remains unconscious for many millions of years. But when the creation is again revived, he is awakened to his work by the Lord. The living entity is eternal, and the wakeful state of his consciousness, manifested by activities, is his natural condition of life. He cannot stop acting while awake, and thus he acts according to his diverse desires. When his desires are trained in the transcendental service of the Lord, his life becomes perfect, and he is promoted to the spiritual sky to enjoy eternal awakened life. 4. When the 23 principal elements were set in action by the will of the Supreme, the gigantic universal form, or the Vishvarup body of the Lord, came into existence. Purport: the Virat Rupa, or Vishvarupa, the gigantic universal form of the Lord, which is very much appreciated by the impersonalist, is not an eternal form of the Lord. It is manifested by the supreme will of the Lord after the ingredients of material creation. Lord Krishna exhibited this Virat, or Vishvarupa, to Arjuna just to convince the impersonalist that he is the original personality of Godhead. Krishna exhibited the Virat Rupa. It is not that Krishna was exhibited by the Virat Rupa. The Virat Rupa is not, therefore, an eternal form of the Lord exhibited in the spiritual sky. It is a material manifestation of the Lord. The Archa Vigraha, or the worshipable deity in the temple, is a similar manifestation of the Lord for the neophytes. But in spite of their material touch, such forms of the Lord as the Virat and Archa are all non-different from his eternal form as Lord Krishna. 5. As the Lord in his plenary portion entered into the elements of the universal creation, they transformed into the gigantic form in which all the planetary systems and all movable and immovable creations rest. Purport. The elements of cosmic creation are all matter and have no potency to increase in volume unless entered into by the Lord in his plenary portion. This means that matter does not increase or decrease unless it is spiritually touched. Matter is a product of spirit and increases only by the touch of spirit. The entire cosmic manifestation has not assumed its gigantic form by itself, as wrongly calculated by less intelligent persons. As long as spirit is within matter, matter can increase as needed, but without the spirit, matter stops increasing. For example, as long as there is spiritual consciousness within the material body of a living entity, the body increases to the required size, but a dead material body which has no spiritual consciousness stops increasing. In Bhagavad Gita, chapter 2, importance is given to the spiritual consciousness, not the body. The entire cosmic body increased by the same process that we experience in our small bodies. One should not, however, foolishly think that the individual infinitesimal soul is the cause of the gigantic manifestation of the universal form. The universal form is called the Virat Rupa because the Supreme Lord is within it in his plenary portion. 6. The gigantic Virat Purusha, known as Hiranmaya, lived for 1,000 celestial years on the water of the universe, and all the living entities lay within him. Purport. After the Lord entered each and every universe as the Govardhana Vishnu, half of the universe was filled with water. The cosmic manifestation of the planetary systems, outer space, etc., which are visible to us, is only one half of the complete universe. Before the manifestation takes place and after the entrance of Vishnu within the universe, there is a period of 1,000 celestial years. All the living entities injected within the womb of the Mahatattva are divided in all universes with the incarnation of Govardhana Vishnu, and all of them lie down with the Lord until Brahma is born. Brahma is the first living being within the universe, and from him all other demigods and living creatures are born. Manu is the original father of mankind, and therefore in Sanskrit, mankind is called Manushya. Humanity in different bodily qualities is distributed throughout the various planetary systems. 7. The total energy of the Mahatattva in the form of the gigantic Virat Rupa divided himself by himself into the consciousness of the living entities. The life of activity and self-identification, which are the total energy of the Mahatattva in the form of the gigantic Virat Rupa, divided himself by himself into the consciousness of the living entities. The life of activity and self-identification, which are subdivided into 1, 10, and 3, respectively. Consciousness is the sign of the living entity or the soul. The existence of the soul is manifest in the form of consciousness, called Jnana Shakti. The total consciousness is that of the gigantic Virat Rupa, and the same consciousness is exhibited in individual persons. The activity of consciousness is performed through the air of life, which is of 10 divisions. The airs of life are called prana, apana, udana, vyana, and samana, and are also differently qualified as naga, kurma, krikara, devadatta, and dhananjaya. The consciousness of the soul becomes polluted by the material atmosphere, and thus various activities are exhibited in the false ego of bodily identification. These various activities are described in Bhagavad Gita 2.41 as bahushaka hyanantascha buddhayo vyavasayina. The conditioned soul is bewildered into various activities for want of pure consciousness. In pure consciousness, the activity is one. The consciousness of the individual soul becomes one with the supreme consciousness when there is complete synthesis between the two. The monist believes that The monist believes that there is only one consciousness, whereas the sattvatas, or the devotees, believe that although there is undoubtedly one consciousness, they are one because there is agreement. The individual consciousness is advised to dovetail with the Supreme Consciousness as instructed by the Lord in Bhagavad Gita 1866. Sarvadharman prityaja mamekam sharanam vraja. The individual consciousness, Arjuna, is advised to dovetail with the Supreme Consciousness and thus maintain his conscious purity. It is foolish to try to stop the activities of consciousness, but they can be purified when they are dovetailed with the Supreme. This consciousness is divided into three modes of self-identification according to the proportion of purity. Adhyatmika, or self-identification with the body and mind. Adibhotika, or self-identification with the material products. And Adhyatmika, or self-identification as a servant of the Lord. Adidaivika, or self-identification as a servant of the Lord. Of the three, Adidaivika, self-identification, is the beginning of purity of consciousness in pursuance of the desire of the Lord. Text number 8. The gigantic universal form of the Supreme Lord is the first incarnation and plenary portion of the Supersoul. He is the self of an unlimited number of living entities, and in him rests the aggregate creation which thus flourishes. The Supreme Lord expands himself in two ways, by personal plenary expansions and separated minute expansions. The personal plenary expansions are Vishnu Tattvas, and the separated expansions are living entities. Since the living entities are very small, they are sometimes described as the marginal energy of the Lord. But the mystic yogis consider the living entities and the Supersoul Paramatma to be one and the same. It is, however, a minor point of controversy. After all, everything created rests on the gigantic Virat, or universal form of the Lord. 9. The gigantic universal form is represented by 3, 10, and 1, in the sense that he is the body and the mind and the senses. He is the dynamic force for all movements by 10 kinds of life energy, and he is the one heart where life energy is generated. Purport. In Bhagavad Gita 7.4-5, it is stated that the 8 elements, earth, water, fire, air, sky, mind, intelligence, and false ego, are all products of the Lord's inferior energy, whereas the living entities who are seen to utilize the inferior energy originally belong to the superior energy, the internal potency of the Lord. The 8 inferior energies work grossly and subtly, whereas the superior energy works as the central generating force. This is experienced in the human body. The gross elements, namely earth, etc., form the external gross body and are like a coat, whereas the subtle mind and false ego act like the inner clothing of the body. The movements of the body are first generated from the heart, and all the activities of the body are made possible by the senses, powered by the 10 kinds of air within the body. The 10 kinds of air are described as follows. The main air passing through the nose in breathing is called prana. The air which passes through the rectum as evacuated bodily air is called apana. The air which adjusts the foodstuff within the stomach and which sometimes sounds as belching is called samana. The air which passes through the throat and the stoppage of which constitutes suffocation is called udana air. And the total air which circulates throughout the entire body is called the vyana air. Subtler than these 5 airs, there are others also. That which facilitates the opening of the eyes, mouth, etc. is called naga air. The air which increases appetite is called krakara air. The air which helps contraction is called kurma air. The air which helps relaxation by opening the mouth wide and yawning is called Devadatta air, and the air which helps sustenance is called Dhananjaya air. All these airs are generated from the center of the heart, which is one only. This central energy is superior energy of the Lord, who is seated within the heart with the soul of the body, who acts under the guidance of the Lord. This is explained in Bhagavad Gita 15:15 as follows. Sarvasya chaham vriddhi sannivishto mattaksmitir jnanam apohanam cha vedaischa sarve ahameva vedyo Vedanta krid veda vedeva chaham. The complete central force is generated from the heart by the Lord, who is seated there and who helps the conditioned soul in remembering and forgetting. The conditioned state is due to the soul's forgetfulness of its relationship of subordination to the Lord. One who wants to continue to forget the Lord is helped by the Lord to forget him birth after birth. But one who remembers him by dint of association with a devotee of the Lord is helped to remember him more and more. Thus the conditioned soul can ultimately go back home, back to Godhead. The process of transcendental help by the Lord is described in Bhagavad Gita 10:10 as follows. Tesham satata yuktanam bhajatam priti purvakam tadami buddhi yogam tam yena mam upayanti te. The buddhi yoga process of self-realization with intelligence, transcendental to the mind, devotional service, can alone elevate one from the conditioned state of material entanglement in the cosmic construction. The conditioned state of the living entity is like that of a person who is within the depths of a huge mechanical arrangement. The mental speculators can reach the point of buddhi yoga after many, many lifetimes of speculation, but the intelligent person who begins from the platform of intelligence above the mind makes rapid progress in self-realization. Because the buddhi yoga process entails no fear or deterioration or retrogression. Because the buddhi yoga process entails no fear of deterioration or retrogression at any time, it is the guaranteed path to self-realization as confirmed in Bhagavad Gita 2:40. The mental speculators cannot understand that the two birds, Shvetashvatara Upanishad, sitting in one tree are the soul and the supersoul. The individual soul eats the fruit of the tree, while the other bird does not eat the fruit, but only observes the activities of the eating bird. Without attachment, the witnessing bird helps the fruit-eating bird perform fruitive activities. One who cannot understand this difference between the soul and supersoul, or God, and the living entities is certainly still in the entanglement of the cosmic machinery, and thus must still await the time when he will be free from bondage. 10. The Supreme Lord is the supersoul of all the demigods entrusted with the task of constructing the cosmic manifestation. Being thus prayed to by the demigods, he thought to himself and thus manifested the gigantic form for their understanding. The impersonalists are captivated by the gigantic universal form of the Supreme. They think that the control behind this gigantic manifestation is imagination. Intelligent persons, however, can estimate the value of the cause by observing the wonders of the effects. For example, the individual human body does not develop from the womb of the mother independently, but because the living entity, the soul, is within the body. Without the living entity, a material body cannot automatically take shape or develop. When any material object displays development, it must be understood that there is a spiritual soul within the manifestation. The gigantic universe has developed gradually, just as the body of a child develops. The conception that the transcendence enters within the universe is, therefore, logical, as the materialists cannot find the soul and the supersoul within the heart. Similarly, for want of sufficient knowledge, they cannot see that the Supreme Soul is the cause of the universe. The Lord is therefore described in the Vedic language as Avan Manasagochara, beyond the conception of words and minds. Due to a poor fund of knowledge, the mental speculators try to bring the Supreme within the purview of words and minds. But the Lord refuses to be intelligible. The speculator has no adequate words or mind to gauge the infinity of the Lord. The Lord is called Adoksaja, or the person who is beyond perception by the blunt, limited potency of our senses. One cannot perceive the transcendental name or form of the Lord by mental speculation. The mundane PhDs are completely unable to speculate on the Supreme with their limited senses. Such attempts by the puffed-up PhDs are compared to the philosophy of the frog in the well. A frog in a well was informed of the gigantic Pacific Ocean, and he began to puff himself up in order to understand or measure the length and breadth of the Pacific Ocean. Ultimately, the frog burst and died. The title PhD can also be interpreted as plow department, a title meant for the tillers in the paddy field. The attempt of the tillers in the paddy field to understand the cosmic manifestation and the cause behind such wonderful work can be compared to the endeavor of the frog in the well to calculate the measurement of the Pacific Ocean. The Lord can reveal himself only to a person who is submissive and who engages in his transcendental loving service. The demigods controlling the elements and ingredients of universal affairs prayed to the Lord for guidance, and thus he manifested his gigantic form as he did at the request of Arjuna. Maitreya said, "You may now hear from me how the Supreme Lord separated himself into the diverse forms of the demigods after the manifestation of the gigantic universal form." Purport: the demigods are separated parts and parcels of the Supreme Lord, as are all other living entities. The only difference between the demigods and the ordinary living entities is that when the living entities are rich in pious acts of devotional service to the Lord, and when their desire to lord it over material energy has vanished, they are promoted to the posts of demigods, who are entrusted by the Lord with executing the management of the universal affairs. Agni, or heat, separated from his mouth, and all the directions of material affairs entered into it in their respective positions. By that energy, the living entity expresses himself in words. Purport: the mouth of the gigantic universal form of the Lord is the source of the speaking power. The director of the fire element is the controlling deity, or the Adidaiva. The speeches delivered are adhyatma, or bodily functions, and the subject matter of the speeches is material productions, or the Adi Bhuta principle. When the palate of the gigantic form was separately manifested, Varuna, the director of air in the planetary systems, entered therein, and thus the living entity has the facility to taste everything with his tongue. When the palate of the gigantic form was separately manifested, Varuna, the director of air, When the palate of the gigantic form was separately manifested, Varuna, the director of water in the planetary systems, entered therein, and thus the living entity has the facility to taste everything with his tongue. When the Lord's two nostrils separately manifested themselves, the dual Ashvini Kumaras entered them in their proper positions. And because of this, the living entities can smell the aromas of everything. Thereafter, the two eyes of the gigantic form of the Lord were separately manifested. The sun, the director of light, entered them with the partial representation of eyesight, and thus the living entities can have vision of forms. When there was a manifestation of skin separated from the gigantic form, Anila, the deity directing the wind, entered within partial touch, and thus the living entities can realize tactile knowledge. When the ears of the gigantic form became manifested, all the controlling deities of the directions entered into them with the hearing principles by which all the living entities hear and take advantage of sound. Purport: the ear is the most important instrument in the body of the living entity. Sound is the most important medium for carrying the message of distant and unknown things. The perfection of all sound or knowledge enters through the ear and makes one's life perfect. The entire Vedic system of knowledge is received by oral reception only, and thus sound is the most important source of knowledge. 18. When there was a separate manifestation of skin, the controlling deities of sensations and their different parts entered into it, and thus the living entities feel itching and happiness due to touch. Purport: for sense perception there are two principal items, touch and itching, and both of them are controlled by the skin and hairs on the body. According to Sri Vishwanath Chakravarti, the controlling deity of touch is the air passing within the body, and the controlling deity of the hairs on the body is Oshadya. For the skin, the object of perception is touch, and for the hairs on the body, the object of perception is itching. 19. When the genitals of the gigantic form separately became manifest, then Prajapati, the original living creature, entered into them with his partial semen, and thus the living entities can enjoy sex pleasure. The evacuating channel separately became manifest, and the director named Mitra entered into it with partial organs of evacuation. Thus the living entities are able to pass stool and urine. Thereafter, when the hands of the gigantic form separately became manifested, Indra, the ruler of the heavenly planets, entered into them, and thus the living entity is able to transact business for his livelihood. Thereafter, the legs of the gigantic form separately became manifest, and the demigod named Vishnu, not the personality of Godhead, entered with partial movement. This helps the living entity move to his destination. When the intelligence of the gigantic form separately became manifest, Brahma, the Lord of the Vedas, entered into it with the partial power of understanding, and thus an object of understanding is experienced by the living entities. After that, the heart of the gigantic form separately manifested itself, and into it entered the moon demigod with partial mental activity. Thus the living entity can conduct his mental speculations. Thereafter, the materialistic ego of the gigantic form separately manifested itself, and into it entered Rudra, the controller of false ego, with his own partial activities by which the living entity transacts his objective actions. Purport: the false ego of materialistic identity is controlled by the demigod Rudra, an incarnation of Lord Shiva. Rudra is the incarnation of the Supreme Lord, who controls the mode of ignorance within material nature. The activities of the false ego are based on the objective of the body and mind. Most persons conducted by the false ego are controlled by Lord Shiva. When one reaches a finer version of ignorance, he falsely thinks of himself as the Supreme Lord. The egoistic conviction of the conditioned soul is the last snare of the illusory energy which controls the entire material world. Thereafter, when his consciousness separately manifested itself, the total energy, Mahat Tattva, entered with his conscious part. Thus, the living entity is able to conceive specific knowledge. Thereafter, from the head of the gigantic form, the heavenly planets were manifested, and from his legs, the earthly planets, and from his abdomen, the sky separately manifested themselves. Within them, the demigods and others also were manifested in terms of the modes of material nature. The demigods, qualified by the super excellent quality of the mode of goodness, are situated in the heavenly planets, whereas the human beings, because of their nature in the mode of passion, live on the earth in company with their subordinates. In Bhagavad Gita 14:14 through 15, it is said that those who are highly developed in the mode of goodness are promoted to the higher heavenly planetary system, and those who are overpowered by the mode of passion are situated in the middle planetary systems, the earth and similar planets. But those who are surcharged with the mode of ignorance are degraded to the lower planetary systems or to the animal kingdom. The demigods are highly developed in the mode of goodness, and thus they are situated in the heavenly planets. Below human beings are the animals, although some of them mingle with human society. Cows, horses, dogs, etc. are habituated to living under the protection of human beings. The word atyantikena is very significant in this verse. By development of the mode of goodness of material nature, one can become situated in the heavenly planets. But by excessive development of the modes of passion and ignorance, the human being indulges in killing the animals who are meant to be protected by mankind. Persons who indulge in unnecessary animal killing have excessively developed in the mode of passion and ignorance and have no hope of advancing to the mode of goodness. They are destined to be degraded to lower statuses of life. The planetary systems are calculated as upper and lower in terms of the classes of living entities who live there. 29. Living entities who are associates of Rudra develop in the third mode of material nature, or ignorance. They are situated in the sky between the earthly planets and the heavenly planets. Purport. This middle portion of the sky is called Bhuvarloka, as confirmed by both Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti and Sri Jiva Goswami. In Bhagavad Gita it is said that those who develop in the mode of passion are situated in the middle region. Those who are situated in the mode of goodness are promoted to the regions of the demigods. Those who are situated in the mode of passion are placed in human society, and those who are situated in the mode of ignorance are placed in the society of animals or ghosts. There are no contradictions to this conclusion. Numerous living entities are distributed all over the universe in different planets and are so situated in terms of their own qualities in the modes of material nature. O chief of the Kuru dynasty, the Vedic wisdom became manifested from the mouth of the Virat, the gigantic form. Those who are inclined to this Vedic knowledge are called Brahmanas, and they are the natural teachers and spiritual masters of all the orders of society. And now I'll take a few reflections or questions. Krishna Saka, then Bukharavinda.
I have a question from the previous session. Actually, there was a mention that Samba is the expansion of Kartikeya. I understand that Krishna can have multiple expansions, but how can, like, they were fighting in war also, like when the war was between Krishna and Lord Shiva, because of the Banashur, they were fighting against not each other but in the same war. How can one soul be there like in Samba and Kartikeya?
You mean you want to know like the technology?
No, I mean how can
Krishna do it? You said Krishna could do it. How does he do it?
No, Krishna has expansions.
He has what?
He can expand like in Vishnu Tattvas or Shiva Tattvas.
So if he can do it, the living entities can do it too. Just as Krishna does amazing things because he's the greatest, the living entities can do amazing things also, but on a much smaller scale. There's much written about the various expansions, and it's quite clear that living entities can have expansions. I just happened to be passing Mukunda Datto at the Vrindavan temple, and we got into a very short conversation in between artiques. And then he brought up this point about the expansions of living entity, and he said, yes, it's a big subject. But it's definitely there. There are discussions about how the various demigods enter into the pastimes of Krishna, and then sometimes they merge into another living entity, and then they unmerge, and so forth. So I asked you about the technology because I couldn't tell you exactly how they do it. I didn't even know how Krishna does it, but he does. So living beings do that.
So
Yes.
how can we understand when we say soul is indivisible or not, can't be divided or something, right? Here we see that it's getting like.
Well, it's more of a extension than it is dividing into two people. It's indivisible, but there's a way in which consciousness can be in two places at once. Just like yesterday I was reading a sentence, and then I came to the end of it, and I thought, although I read it and my eyeball looked at it, I was completely somewhere else. You could be sitting here and thinking about being on Sankirtan in Yellowstone Park, being chased by a bison or something. I mean, you're one person, but you've expanded your consciousness in different places. I don't know the technology. I just know that the Shastra says living entities can be expanded into different forms at the same time even.
One more quick one.
One more imponderable? Go ahead.
So, is that
is
there a thing that we are in spiritual world also and we are here? Like this, it will come, I think, in third canto also, that we are dreaming, and it's like when they explain how spiritual entity come in contact with the matter, the answer it is often given is that how in a dream one can see the head cut off. And similarly, that is the answer I think they give. So is it correct to understand that one can be in spiritual one, but it is dreaming there, and that's why we are here, something like that?
We're coming to, I think it's in this canto actually, the description of seeing one's head cut off in a dream. It's also something we read today, even that conditioned souls are conscious, their consciousness is absorbed in the modes of nature in the material world. There's no modes in the spiritual world.
But I was appreciating that how Prabhupada he uses this word Vedic wisdom. They're all given chance to take advantage of the Vedic wisdom and found out their relationship with the Supreme Lord. He uses such a nice phrases, Vedic wisdom. So I was just appreciating in one of the purport. And also the fate, he defined the unseen guidance is described as fate when he was describing in the same purport, like how how it is just their desire, and then they continued that desire and super soul is facilitating their desire in the next body, and that guidance, unseen guidance, is described as a fate. So I was just appreciating that point. And another purport Prabhupada says about the consciousness, and I remember one of the new person asked this question, like is everyone's consciousness is same or is a difference? And Prabhupada's very nicely described in this purport that it is same, but they are same in the desire, not the, obviously, the Supreme Consciousness and our consciousness is different, but they are same, but not in, 1 minute, I'll read exactly the Munis believe that there is only one consciousness, whereas the Sattvatas or the devotees believe that although there is undoubtedly one consciousness, they are one because there is agreement. There is a very finer point.
No disagreement. When Prabhupada describes the ways of living entities sleeping in the material world, he also mentions that we're never out of contact with Krishna, even we're within Mahavishnu. So really, we're never separated from Krishna, but we're separated by consciousness. Vayam dvitiya binibeshatasyad ishad apetasya viparya yosmriti, because we've turned our awareness by our own decision away from Krishna, and therefore we're not aware of our connection with Krishna. That's Maya. Ratirtam yat pratiyeta napratiyeta chatmani tadvidyat atmano mayam yatabaso yatatamaha. As soon as one misses one's connection with Krishna, although we're always with Krishna, we're part of Krishna. Even we're in Mahavishnu, we're in Krishna. And we're enveloped by Krishna. Even the material energy is Krishna. Yasmin yato yarhiyena cha yasma yatad yaditaras tva para paro bhava karoti vikaroti pratak svabhava sanjoditas tak akilam bhavatak swarupam. So we're separated by consciousness. Otherwise, a lot of those discussions about where am I, where did I fall from, how did I fall, we've already heard twice since we started reading here. Prabhupada just gave a really simple answer. The more of a detailed description of where you are and how you got here, and well, where you are, that's one thing, but how you got here and how you got separated and so forth. Mostly Prabhupada gives very simple answers, not convoluted answers. Although when pressed for it, he gave some answers that gave rise to people developing doctrines in various ways, which don't seem to be very helpful, because if you've ever read any of the descriptions all the way through carefully, at the end, you're still not going to be satisfied. It's not like you go, aha, I found it. You just keep turning the page until you get to the very end and go, that's it?
I thought it was interesting how in verse 8, Srila Prabhupada says, but the mystic yogis consider the living entities and the supersoul Paramatma to be one and the same.
Yeah.
It is, however, a minor point of controversy.
No big deal.
After all, everything created rests on the gigantic Virata or universal form of the Lord. Because in other places, that distinction is taken as a major point of distinction, that's what makes somebody qualified to be practicing bhakti, is that they recognize the personhood distinctiveness.
There's another place where Prabhupada says that too. Mahat sevam dwaram muhurva muktes tamo dwaram yoshitam yosangi sangam mahantaste samachita prasanta vimanyalak surija saravoye. And then he puts the impersonalists and the personalists in one category as transcendentalists. Whether one is this or that, it's still... So, yeah. Depends how much you want to lean into it.
I just thought it was interesting because those are two examples where he kind of like, the apeta part, the non-difference, but there's like probably 200 examples where he focuses on the difference. So it's, when it comes up this way, I was like kind of raising an eyebrow of like, why? So I don't know, but I just thought that was neat.
Will you read it again?
Since the living entities are very small, they are sometimes described as the marginal energy of the Lord, but the mystic yogis consider the living entities and the supersoul Paramatma to be one and the same. It is, however, a minor point of controversy. After all, everything created rests on the gigantic Virat or universal form of the Lord.
Has a lot to do with the context. We're talking about the universal form, the all-enveloping idea that we're all in Krishna and everything's emanating from him. So in that context, it's not as big a deal as when you get down into the refinement of it. Prabhu?
It was mentioned that the Mayavad philosophy is the last snare, or this conception of thinking the jiva and the supersoul is equal as being the last snare of the illusory energy of Maya. And I was just wondering, would that also mean that if one is able to recognize and overcome this Mayavad philosophy in their own heart, would that mean they're free of the snare of Maya?
Well, Krishna says in the 12th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita that such persons can, with great trouble, come to the end of that if they dedicate themselves to that conception completely, not armchair speculators kind of thing. They go through all that. He said they can come to the end of that. Are you aware of that section I'm talking about? He says, Klesho dikartaras tesham avyakta sakta chaitasam avyakta hi katir dukam dehavad viravapyate. And then he mentions, does Krishna, that such people being dedicated to the welfare of all, going on doing that, there's a point at which they can come to the end of it. I wouldn't say categorically, because the material nature has a lot of snares. But hopefully, one would, I mean, we have, yeah. I mean, just as far as answering the question goes, I stick with my answer from the Bhagavad Gita.
I guess maybe I missed it. I was just...
Well, because of the semantics of the last snare, and then you say, like, okay, get rid of that one, there's nothing left, right?
Yeah, I was thinking, like someone in devotional service, they're coming into devotional service, I find myself, there's still conditions, and to, find the proper conception within myself, and
well, even if they
fully
merge,
fixed in that.
then Aruya Krishna Parampadam Tata, they fall back down again because they haven't developed a conception of Krishna. It's not by negation that they become free. They actually have to have positive application to the lotus-eyed Lord and a relationship by association with pure devotees, and then there's the chance of overcoming that. Otherwise, impersonalists tend to get back involved in the material world because they're not satisfied with nothing. I'll give you my answer now if you like. My answer is nothing. And then you're like, okay, that's it. I think I'll go to the movies and have a frosty malt in the material world. Any other things?
Hare Krishna.
Yes?
Is there any indication why Maitreya is explaining this Virat Purusha to Vidura at this point?
How come we can't hear him here? At least I couldn't hear. What did he say?
What's the explanation that Maitreya is giving this description of Virat?
Why is he doing this?
At this point.
Because Vidura asked about it. He asked about it in the beginning. That was his question in the beginning. And now we've come to the cow break. We'll be back here, Krishna willing, at 20 minutes after. Have a good cow break. Gaur Premanande Hari Bol.